The content of this episode is for entertainment purposes only. Historical events discussed are based on documented records, scholarly research, and primary sources. This episode does contain discussions of mass execution, torture, the persecution and execution of children, and systematic religious violence. The Velvet Guillotine does not endorse any political, religious, or ideological interpretation of the events portrayed. The criticism offered here is directed at the documented conduct of specific historical figures and the institutional structures of a particular era, not any faith, religious community, or the beliefs of that community's adherents. This episode is told in remembrance of the people, men, women, and children, who were accused, tortured, and killed in the Würzburg and Bamberg witch trials. Listener discretion is strongly advised. I want to read you a list. There is a document, and it's called the Würzburg Chronicle, that records executions carried out in the city of Würzburg between 1626 and 1631. And this was under the authority of Prince Bishop Philipp Adolf von Ehrenberg. It is not a manifesto. It is not a confession. It is a ledger. There are rows and rows of names and descriptions, and they were set down by administrators doing their job. There's accounting, line by tidy line, for what was being done to their neighbors. So let me read you some of these entries. The wife of a brewer, the wife of a counselor, the blind girl, a student who knew too many languages, a boy of 12 years old, a boy of 10 years old, a girl of 9 years old, 2 boys, each 7 years old, the little daughter of the doctor, a noble boy of 9 years, a girl of 15, a girl of 12, another girl, and another, and another. The vicar of the chapel cathedral, a canon of the cathedral, the chancellor's fat wife, a pretty young woman, a woman who was accounted as the most beautiful in Würzburg, the court painter, the innkeeper's wife of the dragon, a blind woman, an old woman reputed to be the richest in the city. 157 people are set down in that chronicle. And that was before the record simply goes out. Because in early 1629, with the killing still very much underway, the fuller estimates get worse. There are perhaps 219, maybe, give or take, in the city itself, and as many as 900 across the entire territory that Ehrenberg governed. The document does not record their crimes. It records their professions, their relationships, and their physical descriptions. The fat wife, the pretty young woman, the blind girl, the boy of 10, and it described them as though it was inventorying stock. And this was not a mob. A mob does not keep a ledger. This was a government. A prince bishop with a staff, a court, legal procedures, and a filing system. Everything was in order, and everything was written down. Welcome to the Velvet Guillotine. I'm April Rain, and today we're talking about the Würzburg witch trials of 1626 to 1631. One of the largest, most systematic witch trials ever conducted. And it is also the most thoroughly documented witch hunt in all of European history. And before we are finished, we're going to travel about 80 miles east to the city of Bamberg, where the very same moment a second machine was running on the very same plans. Because the most important thing about Würzburg is that Würzburg was not alone. This is not going to be a story about superstitious peasants. This is not a story about hysteria boiling up from below. This is not a story about the devil. It is a story about educated men in positions of institutional authority running an organized program of identification, persecution, and execution that killed hundreds of people, including children as young as 7. And they had the full apparatus of the legal and bureaucratic order behind them. The terrifying thing about the Würzburg trials is not that they were irrational, it's that they weren't irrational at all. So when you're ready, let's go. So to be fair, in order to truly understand what happened in Würzburg between 1626 and 1631, you have to understand what Germany was like in 1626. And in 1626, Germany was actually a wound that simply would not close. More precisely, the Holy Roman Empire, that's the fragmented patchwork that occupied most of what we now call Germany, Austria, and most of Central Europe. Well, that was in the early stages of what would become the most devastating conflict on the continent until the 20th century. And that, my friends, is the 30 Years' War. So it had begun in 1618, and it was a fight between Protestant and Catholic powers within the empire. It was set off by the defenestration of Prague. And if you don't know what that means, that is the literal hurling of imperial officials out of a window by Protestant Bohemian nobles. This conflict would draw in most of the European powers. It ground on until about 1648, and it killed somewhere between 4 and 8 million people through violence, famine, and disease. And in some German regions, the population fell by a third. In other regions, it fell by half. And these were not casualties of a battle. These were simply the casualties of the way of life coming apart at the seams. By 1626, the war was about 8 years old and it had no end in sight. The empire was economically shattered, trade strangled, and the social hierarchies that ordered daily life were beginning to come apart in people's hands. And then, in the spring of 1626, the weather turned on Würzburg directly. A hard frost crept in and destroyed all of the grape harvest. Just keep in mind that this was a region whose economy and whose identity ran on the vine. And so this was not an inconvenience. It was a catastrophe with a date attached. People were already frightened, already hungry, and already watching the war creep ever closer. And they now had a specific, recent, undeniable disaster to explain. This is the detail that I want you to hold on to, because this is literally the spark that gets laid against the kindling. You have a frightened, war-ground population, and you have a sudden, ruined harvest. And so that brings an old, ready question that's hanging in the cold air over the dead vines. Who did this to us? Not what, but who? And when a community has been taught that misfortune has an author, the failure of the grapes is not the weather. It then becomes evidence, because somebody is to blame. And if there is somebody to blame, then that somebody, therefore, can be found. And Würzburg was run by a prince bishop. This was literally a territory where religious and political authority were fused together in a single man. The prince bishop was all at once the highest spiritual authority and the ruling political power. There was literally no separation of church and state, and there was no institutional check on that combined authority. I mean, there was a little bit of distant and just really entirely inattentive oversight from the Holy Roman Emperor and from the Pope, but neither of them was minding the internal affairs of a mid-sized German ecclesiastical territory in the middle of a continental war, let me tell you. But I want to be precise here, because this is the spine of the entire episode. Those conditions were structural, and they were not accidental. And they also were not inevitable. Not every prince bishop under those same pressures produced a Würzburg. But if you assemble the ingredients, the concentrated authority, the absent oversight, the economic terror, and a fresh catastrophe that was demanding a culprit, and then you throw in a ready-made intellectual and legal framework for naming an enemy, well then, my friend, you have built the conditions under which something like Würzburg can actually ignite, escalate, and run unchecked for about 5 years before anything at all even tries to stop it. So before we can talk about the trials themselves, we have to talk about the scaffolding. You know, the scaffolding that held those particular trials up. Because the persecution of witches in early modern Europe was not a failure of intelligence. It was grounded in a specific, developed, widely accepted theological and legal framework that educated, serious people took very seriously. Its foundational text was published in 1486. That's the Milesium Maleficorum, or the Hammer of Witches. It was written by Dominican Inquisitor Heinrich Kramer, with Jacob Springer traditionally named right alongside him. It became one of the early runaway successes of the printing press, and by 1600 it had gone through at least 28 different editions. It was read by judges, clergy, and magistrates, who were all the educated men who ran those witch trials. And it was, in the most literal sense, a manual. You could buy it. You could shelve it next to your law books if you wanted to, and you could look up a procedure. The Milesius did 3 jobs, and it did them with a terrible competence. First job was it systemized the theology. That's how witches made their pacts with the devil, and how those pacts were granted, and how the powers operated, and which signs betrayed those. The second, it built the legal machinery. That's how to identify a witch, how to interrogate a witch, how to extract a confession, and what counted as sufficient proof. And the third job was that it devoted considerable energy to explaining why women were so much more susceptible to witchcraft than men. Its answer to that third question was actually rooted in a deeply misogynistic anthropology. And that anthropology is that women were weaker in faith, they were more given to carnal temptation, they were more easily deceived, and they were more inclined to revenge through supernatural means. The Milesius did not invent misogyny, but what it did do was give misogyny a theological and legal codification. And this legal codification allowed that the targeting of women stopped being a prejudice that anyone needed to examine. And it became instead, at least within this framework, a finding to be applied. That is the quiet violence of this book, because it took a hatred and reissued it as a conclusion with citations. So now I want to draw out 2 features of the machinery in particular, because they are the parts of the machinery that actually did the killing. So the first feature is the category of evidence that the framework would accept. In an ordinary criminal matter, you need an act. That's a body, a theft, or a witness to the deed. But in witchcraft, you have no act that you can actually point to. So this framework accepted instead the invisible. They would take the confession of an accomplice, the mark on the skin, the testimony of a child, the dream, or even the spectral sighting. And once a court will convict you on evidence that cannot by its nature be disproved, well, then anyone who's accused has already lost, because there is no alibi for a crime that you commit in spirit. And so that brings me to the second feature. And the second feature is the absence of a defense. Under the framework as it was applied in the German trials, the accused was routinely denied any type of legal counsel. So now I want you to think about what that removes. That removes anyone whose job it is to test the evidence, to question the witnesses, to slow the proceeding down, or to ask any inconvenient questions. The single role in the entire process designed to say wait was deleted on purpose. And what remained was a procedure with no friction in it anywhere. And here's the kicker. It wasn't even universally accepted. There were theologians who disputed it, jurisdictions that barely used it. But in the German territories of the late 16th and early 17th centuries, and we're talking about territories that were wound tight by anxieties of the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, and wars, well, it actually stood as a credible, widely cited intellectual authority. And the men who ran the Würzburg trials, they weren't operating out of some type of superstition. They were operating out of a developed theological system that was backed by scholarship, legal tradition, and institutional authority. They had footnotes, y'all. And that is the first thing to understand about how the people in that chronicle that I told you about in the beginning of the episode, about how they died. Prince Bishop Philipp Adolf von Ehrenberg was not a monster in the way that the word invites you to picture it. He was not visibly unhinged, and he was not personally depraved. He was, by the standards of the era and his station, a fairly typical Counter-Reformation Prince Bishop. He was educated, he was zealous, he was politically able, and he was sincerely committed to the spiritual welfare of his territory as he understood it. And I need you to hold on to how ordinary that is for the time, because the ordinariness of it is the actual entire horror. And I'm not going to hand you the comfort of a cartoon villain that orchestrated it. He came to power in Würzburg in 1623, and it was during a surge of Catholic resurgence across the empire. The Catholic League had been winning at this point, and the Protestant giants of the early Reformation were being rolled way back. The Counter-Reformation, which was the Church's systematic answer to the Protestant challenge, was at a full institutional force. And a Prince Bishop who wished to be seen as a serious instrument in that resurgence had a way to demonstrate it. And that way was by cleansing his territory of the devil. And the trials did not begin with him. They actually began under his predecessor and uncle, Julius Ector von Messelbrunn, and Ehrenberg inherited the machine that was already idling. The framework was already in place, the precedents were already set, and the personnel was already available. But under his authority from 1626 onward, the brutality only escalated. The apparatus was formalized, and the pace was actually accelerated, and the scope of the accusations widened until it has no edge left at all. Now, Ehrenberg himself was not down in those cells turning the screws to these people. He had a staff. There was a court, there were judges, there were executioners, and there were scribes that were keeping the record in good order. He was the administrative and theological authority over a process that, once it had institutional backing, it largely ran on its own momentum. And that is the part that I want you to hold above all of the rest of what I'm going to say. The Würzburg trials did not require Ehrenberg to be personally cruel at every step. But they did require him to authorize the system, to maintain the institutional will to keep it running, and this is the whole of it, to decline to apply any breaks to the system at all. The individual cruelties were parceled out across a staff of ordinary people who were working ordinary institutional jobs. One man pricked, one man hoisted the rope, and then a completely different man wrote it all down in a steady hand and then went back home to his supper. The evil was structural, and structural evil does not need evil people at every node. It just needs enabling people who are following procedure and not asking the one question that could possibly make that procedure stop. So now let me walk you through how the Würzburg trials actually operated. And I mean step by procedural step. Because I'll be honest with you, the horror mainly lives in the paperwork. The very first thing that I need you to know is that all of this ran through a committee. Würzburg, like Bamberg after it, established a standing witch-hunting commission. It was a body of clerical and legal officials whose entire function was to administer the trials. And I want you to sit with that particular word for a second. Commission. It is the language of drainage projects and tax assessments. And it is the most ordinary administrative form that a society has. And here it was, pointed at the population, meeting and deliberating and keeping minutes and turning the question of who burns next into an item on an agenda. The commission is the mechanism by which the cruelty got distributed until no single person was actually carrying it anymore. Everyone was just doing their part in the process, and the process itself, well, that's what actually did the killing. It all began with an accusation. Somebody would get named by a neighbor, by a person already on trial, by an anonymous denunciation, sometimes even by a child. And the commission would receive the name every single time. Then the accused were arrested. And so far, it still holds the shape of the law, right? So here's the first place that the shape actually becomes a trap. The names of the accusers were held from the accused. You were not told who had named you. You were not told on what grounds, and you were not told on what evidence. You could not face your accuser. You could not contest a specific claim, and you could not so much as learn what you were supposed to have done. You were required to defend yourself against a charge whose contents you were forbidden to know. So I want you to consider that for just a minute. I want you to consider how elegant that is as a mechanism. Because a defense is impossible by design, and the impossibility is dressed up as the protection of witnesses. And so after the arrest would come the physical examination. They would search for the witch's mark, or they would search for a patch of insensible skin to be located by pricking you with a needle. The examination was actually carried out by official prickers. And we know now that some of those prickers of the era used rigged instruments. They would have needles with retractable points, or they would have blades that slid up under the handle so that the steel appeared to sink into the flesh while never breaking the skin. Let me say that again. We have evidence now that some of the prickers of that era used rigged instruments. But the fraud was not actually in the corruption of the evidentiary process. The fraud was built into the instrument itself, so the tool was manufactured to lie. And if your examination proved inconclusive, or if the accused declined to confess, then torture was applied. And in Würzburg, like everywhere else, the methods were legally prescribed. They were written down, and they were regulated. The most commonly used was the strappado, where the arms were bound behind the back, the body was hoisted by the wrists, and sometimes you would have chains tied to your feet, and your shoulders would pop out of their sockets. This caused very severe and permanent damage to the body. And there was a form for it, and there was a fee for it. Under this torture, the accuser was told to confess and name their accomplices. And the naming of the accomplices is actually the engine. It is the single mechanism by which a witch trial stops being a series of trials and actually becomes a chain reaction. Every person tortured into confession was required to name others who they had supposedly seen at the devil's Sabbath. Those names became fresh arrests, and those fresh arrests produced fresh torture, and that fresh torture produced fresh names. This system did not need a continuing supply of accusations from outside of it. It had been engineered to manufacture its own fuel, and it had also been manufactured to burn whoever was the nearest. Confessions were also governed by these same types of prescribed, written down, and regulated methods. The confessions by anyone had to be confirmed voluntarily, the following day, and free of coercion. This was a safeguard on paper. But I want you to consider what voluntary can possibly mean after days or weeks of torture and imprisonment with no counsel, no knowledge of the charge, and no contact with anyone who actually loves you. If you recanted, the torture resumed. And if you confirmed, then you were convicted on your own testimony. There was one door, and it opened one way. The confirmation step did not protect the accused. It actually just laundered their confession. The convicted were executed by burning, and usually as a mercy, they were strangled or beheaded first. Although that mercy was not universally applied and it was not guaranteed. The property, of course, was confiscated. And then comes the detail that I actually find the coldest in the entire procedure. And this is also the one that will tell you exactly the type of people that were running this operation. The cost of the trial and the execution, the judge's fees, the executioner's fees, and the very wood that was used for the pyre, they were all itemized and billed to the estate of the person. So when your family received, in addition to your body, they also received an invoice. So that means that the institution that just killed your mother, your brother, your sister, or your child then sent you a receipt. And that confiscated estate, it had to go somewhere, of course. So I want you to keep that in mind, because I'm going to follow the money to Bamberg, and that's where the accounting becomes even plainer. The most revealing feature of the Würzburg trials is the one that lays the machine's logic completely bare. And that is who actually ended up being accused. Witch trials almost everywhere begin at the margins. The first targets were typically the most vulnerable people in the community. Poor people, the elderly, the eccentric, the socially isolated, the woman with no husband or no powerful family to speak for her. And in the early stages, Würzburg actually ran true to this pattern. Poor women, low-status individuals, and people whose position made them easy to take, and whose deaths the community could absorb without protest. But the mechanism of forced naming could not stay at those margins, because it simply was not built to. As the trials wore on and the supply of marginal victims thinned, the names that were now coming out under torture began to climb the social ladders of the community. Members of the city council, members of the cathedral chapter, wealthy merchants, the wives of prominent men, the relatives of the very men running the trials. The machine had been fed on the powerless, and having exhausted all of them, it simply kept eating upward, and it was indifferent to rank. The Chronicle records it plainly. The canon, the court painter, the woman accounted the most beautiful in the city, and the old woman who reputed the richest. Because wealth didn't save you in this system. Because in a system that was confiscating estates like this, wealth may have actually put a target on your back. And then there were the children. This is the feature of the Würzburg trials that I actually find the most devastating. And it's because the chroniclers rendered it the most unbearable precisely because they delivered it so flatly. Children as young as 7 years old were burned as witches in Würzburg. The Chronicle actually records boys of 7, girls of 9, and boys of 7. 2 boys, 7 years old, were tried, convicted, killed, and entered into that ledger in the same even hand that everybody else was. And that framework that I told you about, it permitted every bit of this. Because in the viewpoint of that framework, if witchcraft was a pact with the devil, and a child could make a pact, then a child could be a witch. The Milesis had addressed the question of child witches before, and the court had procedures for trying them. The system did not exclude them, because the system by this point excluded no one. Now, this is the part of the story where it stops being only about Würzburg. Because 80 miles to the east, at the very same time, there was a man sitting in a cell writing a letter. And his letter is the thread that ties the two cities together. His name was Johann Jonas, and he was the burgomaster of Bamberg. And to understand what this letter actually tells us, we have to go to Bamberg and look at the second machine. Bamberg was another prince-bishop-run territory, another self-governing Catholic territory inside of the Holy Roman Empire, under the same war, under the same Counter-Reformation pressure, and the same failed harvests, also the same fear. And in the years that Würzburg was burning its citizens, Bamberg was burning its own. and Bamberg was burning theirs on a scale that would actually match or exceed that of its neighbor. The man at the top was Prince Bishop Johann Georg Fuchs von Dornheim, and he came to power in 1623, which, if you remember, was the same year that Ehrenberg also came into power in Würzburg. And this Prince Bishop actually earned in his lifetime a very famous nickname. They called him the Hexenbrunner, or the witch burner. And his theological enforcer, the engine of his zeal, was a suffragan bishop named Frederick Forner. And under these two men, Bamberg ran a witch persecution that by most estimates killed 300 to 600 people in its main phase. But the fuller toll across the whole persecution reached as high as 1,000. And Bamberg actually gives us the most damning object in this entire history. Because in 1627, as the arrests outran the cells available to them, Dornheim did something that I need you to sit with, because it is the thing that ends forever any notion that this could have possibly been a panic. He built a building. He built a multi-purpose prison for witches, and he called it the Druden House. It was also known as the Malefice House, also known as the House of Wrongdoing. It had a capacity to hold between 30 and 40 prisoners. It had cells. It had dedicated interrogation rooms and torture chambers. And the worst part of all was that in those chambers, painted on the wall, was passages of scripture, so that the accused, while they had the strappado applied to them and was pulling their arms literally out of the socket, they could contemplate the Word of God. So I want to say right now that a panic does not commission architecture. A panic does not draw up plans. It does not hire masons. It does not lay foundations. And it does not paint its torture room with Bible verses. That building was a budget line. It was a capital project. It was the proof in stone and mortar that what was happening in Bamberg was not a fever that swept through some frightened crowd. It was infrastructure. The persecution was expected to be permanent enough to deserve its own premises. And that's not even unique. Smaller witch houses of the exact same design were built in other towns under Bamberg's authority. They were rolling the machine out, building by building, like a chain of franchises. And in Bamberg, the money's not even hidden. The estates of the burned were confiscated, and they always flowed upward. By one accounting, the property seized through the trials exceeded 100,000 florins, and a great deal of that actually ended up in the Prince Bishop's own coffers. And once it ended up in those coffers, it helped to fund the defense of the territory and its wars. If you follow the money on this show, it always leads somewhere uncomfortable. And in Bamberg, it leads a very short, very straight, very well-lit line to this. The people accused of witchcraft were very frequently the people with property worth taking, which is how the machine came for George Hahn. Hahn was a vice-chancellor of the diocese. He was a senior official, and he was a man of standing. And he committed the one unforgivable act inside of a system like this. He tried to slow it down. He had opposed the persecutions, he questioned them, and he attempted to apply the brakes. And the machine, it did exactly to him what it was doing to anyone who ever reached for the brakes. It consumed him. George Hahn was accused, tried as a witch, and burned in 1628, along with his wife and daughter. The man who tried to stop it was fed into it, with his family, and the trials just rolled on. And in the chain of naming, reaching up through that Bamberg's elite, well, they finally got Johannes Eunice. His wife had actually already been executed. Another burgomaster, broken under all of the torture, they named Eunice as an accomplice. And in June of 1628, Eunice was arrested. And the court records show him doing exactly what they all did at first: denying everything, demanding to face his accusers, and insisting on his innocence. and then the torture, and then the confession, and then the names. Because the machine requires names. So he gives it names. And he gives it the names of people that he knew to be innocent, because there was really nothing else left to give. But Johann Eunice did one thing that almost no one in this entire history managed to do. From his cell, condemned, his hands so damaged by the torture that he could barely hold a pen, he wrote the truth down and he got it out. He wrote to his daughter Veronica. The letter was smuggled out of the prison, and it survived. That means that across 4 centuries, we have in his own ruined hand a first-person account of exactly how the machine worked from the inside. In this letter, he tells her what was done to him. He describes the thumbscrews, the strapardo, and the pain that took him to the point where a human being cannot hold a position. He tells her plainly that he confessed to things that had never happened, and that he could not endure the torture, and he said what he had to say. He tells her that he was ordered to name accomplices, and that when he couldn't think of any names, the executioner walked him to the streets of the town, street by street, and he demanded that he produce someone from each, until he had actually named people that he knew had done nothing simply to make the torture stop. He was, in this passage, documenting the naming engine from the inside and showing his daughter and us precisely how an innocent man manufactures the accusations that will arrest the next innocent person. He tells her why he's writing, so that she will know, and so that she will not believe the confession that the court has on file. The line that has come down through the centuries in the plainest words a condemned man could choose. Innocent I have come into prison, innocent I have been tortured, and innocent must I die. He asks her to pray for him. He asks her not to forget him. And he tells her it may be days before he's permitted to die. And he says goodbye. He was executed. The court kept its file, with the confession in it, the official record, the version where Johannes Eunice was a witch who admitted to his crimes. And alongside it, against every intention of the man who ran the machine, his letter survived. The counter record, the truth, smuggled out in a father's shaking hand. Both documents exist, and we get a chance to choose which one we actually believe. Because between you and me, I know which one I believe. Now, I want to stop and I want to say something very, very carefully, because it is actually the easiest thing in the world to say badly. Würzburg and Bamberg rhyme. 2 cities, 80 miles apart, in the same years, doing the same things in the same way, right down to the purpose-built prisons and the burned officials and the confiscated estates. And when you lay them side by side, there is a temptation, and I feel it myself, to reach for a word kind of like echo. And you want to let that word carry a kind of dread, as though some dark thing were moving through the region of its own accord, and as though atrocity called to atrocity across the hills, and as though violence actually had a will. But I actually want to refute that pretty firmly, because it is exactly the comfort that this show exists to take away. There was nothing in the air over these territories. There was no resonance, no contagion of evil drafting from one cathedral town to the next. The 2 cities did not echo each other in a way that echoes sound off of a canyon wall. They echoed each other in the way that 2 places with 2 machines built from the exact same blueprint produce the exact same part. Because that is what they actually were. Same decade, same war, same counter-reformation pressure bearing down, the same Milesis on each shelf, the same denial of counsel, same strapardo, same rigged needles, same forced naming engine, same standing commission turning people into agenda items, same prince bishop with the same fused authority and the same absent oversight. Identical inputs. And you do not need a mystery of any kind to explain why 2 identical inputs will produce 2 identical outputs. You only need to understand that this was the procedure all along, and that procedure run twice will run the exact same. And once you see that, once you understand that the echo is mechanical and not mystical, that it's replication and not resonance, the genuinely frightening thing arrives, and it is far worse than any haunting. Because a haunting is bound to a place, and a curse stays in the room. But a machine, it's portable. A blueprint can travel. And if Würzburg and Bamberg rhyme, well, that's because they ran the same procedure. And the procedure is the thing that matters here. The procedure did not stop at the edge of the diocese, or at the border of the country, or in the year 1631. It goes wherever its inputs are assembled, and it has gone many places since this. The machine did not need witches to run on then, and it definitely does not need them now. The echo is not the ghost. The echo is a warning. The same machine will build the same building anywhere that you give it those same four things. So hold on to that real quick, because I want to bring you back to it here in a little while. There was a man who tried to end it all, and it matters for everything that we have just said. He actually served in both cities. He saw both of the machines running, and he knew that they were exactly the same. Frederick Spree von Langenfeld was a Jesuit priest. He was a confessor to the condemned in Würzburg and in Bamberg. The man whose duty it was to walk behind the convicted to a place of conviction and offer them comfort in their last minutes. He was actually present at many of the killings that these chronicles record. And he saw something that broke something in him. Not his body, because he lived until 1635. But by the accounts that I was able to find, his hair went white early. And those who knew him laid it to the horrors that he had witnessed. He became consumed by a particular certainty. And that certainty was that what was being done was not theologically delicate, not possibly justified, and it was not a difficult question. It was wrong. Plainly, catastrophically wrong. He later said that of all the people that he had accompanied up to the stake pyre, he didn't believe that a single one of them was guilty. He couldn't necessarily say this openly either. A Jesuit priest publicly attacking the witch trials in Counter-Reformation Germany? Well, that was a Jesuit priest that was inviting ruin on himself and his order. He did write a book, and he published it without his name. The Precautions for Prosecutors appeared in 1631, and it is one of the most courageous documents of the 17th century. Spree did not argue that witches do not exist, because let me tell you, that was not a position that a man in this world could safely take. And it was not an argument that really mattered at this point anyway. He argued that from inside the system, the methods that they used to identify and convict witches were structurally incapable of producing a reliable result. That torture manufactures false confessions. That forced naming manufactures accusations with no relationship to guilt. That the system, exactly as designed, would convict the innocent with perfect regularity. He had, in other words, reverse engineered the machine. He had stood at the door of the scaffold in 2 different cities and worked out from the inside that the procedure itself was the killer. Not the devil, not the witches, the procedure. And he was right. And he said it when saying it was real, and it was dangerous, and it took a whole lot of courage. The Precautions for Prosecutors circulated wildly, and it genuinely shifted the later trajectory of witch persecutions in Germany. It did not stop the trials all at once. The momentum of the institutional violence is not arrested by a book, however accurate the book may be. But it did lay down the intellectual ground on which they could eventually be stopped. Spree's authorship was an open secret in his lifetime, and he was never formally punished for it. He did die in 1635 of a fever that he caught while he was tending the sick during a plague outbreak. And he is one of the most genuine heroes in this entire story. Not because he stopped it, because he actually didn't, but because he saw clearly, and he named what he saw, and he paid the risk of naming it. Remember Gregory Hahn, the vice chancellor in Bamberg who tried to slow the machine and was burned at the stake with his family? Well, that was the price of reaching for the brake from inside. Spee actually found the only way to reach for it and survive. He had to do it anonymously, in print, and from a careful distance. That it took that much, that he had to actually publish under a false name to stay alive, well, that should actually tell you everything about how little room the machine left for the word stop. So now, if you'll indulge me, I want to go back to the Würzburg Chronicles and read it one more time. Very closely this time, because the list of the dead is not only a roll call of names. It's actually a social document, and you have to read it with the attention to who is named and how they are described. Because it tells you what the trials were actually doing inside the community that conducted them. And it shows you the same shape that we saw in Bamberg. The early executions were overwhelmingly women. Poor women, low-status women, women who were living on the edge of community life. So you've got the widow, you've got the beggar, you've got the woman with the bad reputation. And these are all classic early-stage victims of witch trials. And their selection actually follows precisely the vulnerabilities that the malice had codified. Women were held more susceptible to witchcraft than men. And the women without the shelter of a powerful husband or family, well, they were the easiest to take. And they did take. And the circle widens, and the profile shifts. Then wealthier women start to appear. These are women whose connections should have protected them and did not. And then came the men, the counselors, the canons, the prosperous merchants. The social logic that governed the earlier targeting, it had been overrun by the procedural logic of force naming. And force naming has no respect for status and no off switch. The same upward march that took George Hahn and Jonas Eunice were written by name into the Würzburg ledger. And then, again, the children. The children are actually the clearest possible evidence that the system had severed all connection to the social logic that had first structured it. No theory of witch targeting, not social vulnerability, not property dispute, and not community grudge, none of those explain the burning of a 7-year-old boy. I don't care how you cut it. No theory of social control explains what the execution of a child is supposed to accomplish. The children are the machine consuming itself. The mechanism is running purely on its own momentum. Its original rationale long exhausted and continuing for no reason other than the procedure has not been stopped. Now, if you read all of those chronicles as a social document, it actually shows the whole life cycle of a witch hunt. You have the targeted beginning, you have the expanding middle, and you have the self-consuming end. The same arc appears in Würzburg, in Bamberg, and in Salem a half a century later and an ocean away. It doesn't matter where the mechanism starts because it runs the exact same course. Because the course is the property of the mechanism and not the place. We keep saying that, and the Chronicle actually keeps proving it. Both machines stopped at almost the exact same moment, in 1631. And I want you to mark how they stopped, because the ending is actually part of the argument. They did not stop because the courts ran out of accused. They did not stop because the framework was refuted. They did not stop because Ehrenberg or Dornheim experienced a change of heart. In Bamberg, there had been mounting outside pressure. They had received petitions reaching the emperor, and Ferdinand II eventually issued mandates against the persecutions in 1630 and 1631. This was the beginning of the slow friction of complaints from people who had escaped the territory and had gone looking for someone and I mean anyone, with the authority to intervene. And that pressure actually helped. But what actually ended both machines was far cruder than any of that. The war arrived at their gates. In 1631, the forces of Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, who was Protestant and had no friends in the Counter-Reformation establishment, he swept into Franconia. And Philipp Adolf von Ehrenberg died the same year that the Swedes took Würzburg. Johann Georg Fuchs von Dornheim, well, he fled Bamberg ahead of the advance, and he died 2 years later in exile in Austria. The Druden house was emptied and shut because the Swedish occupants had no interest in conducting any type of witch trials. The court's infrastructure was disrupted, scattered, and displaced. And in the chaos of military occupation, both machines simply stopped. They weren't switched off. They just got knocked over. This is not a satisfying ending, y'all, and I refuse to dress it up as one. The trials didn't stop because somebody proved them wrong, or because justice arrived, or even because the institution looked at itself and recoiled. The book that had proved them wrong was already written, and it didn't stop them. They stopped because a foreign army happened to march through. External force, not internal reform. In neither city was the brake ever pulled from inside. It was knocked loose from the outside, by accident, by war. And elsewhere, the killing simply continued. The broader pattern of witch persecution across German territories persisted, in various forms, into the late 17th and early 18th centuries. The last known execution for witchcraft in Germany took place in 1775. In case you're keeping count, that's nearly a century and a half after the Duden house closed its doors. And the intellectual challenge that Spee and the others raised did eventually change the law. But slowly, and contested at every step, and it took decades. And in the meantime, people just kept right on dying. The machine, even though it was knocked over in Franconia, was reassembled elsewhere, because it always could be. And that was the point of it being a machine. I want to be direct about the application, because with witch trials, it is dangerously easy to slip into the comforting belief that we are discussing something that is safely sealed in the past. That we make the assumption that it needed a specific theology, or a specific institution, or a specific culture that is gone and cannot come back again. The theology of witchcraft is gone, at least in the form that it took in 17th century Germany. But the specific instruments, the witch's mark, the strappado, the public burning, the Duden house with its scriptures on the torture walls, all of that is gone. But the mechanism that produced Würzburg and Bamberg is not gone. Here is the mechanism, stated plainly, one last time. A community under stress, holding a concentrated authority with very little external oversight, is handed a framework that identifies an internal enemy as the source of its suffering. The framework comes with procedures for finding and eliminating that enemy. The procedures are self-expanding, which means that each persecution generates new names, new accusations, and new arrests. The social logic that first aimed at the vulnerable gives way to a procedural logic that aims at whoever gets named. And the institution continues, because stopping it would require some individual to bear the cost of stopping it. To be the George Hahn, to be the Spree. And almost no one on the outside has sufficient incentive or sufficient courage to pay that price. The mechanism actually doesn't require witchcraft. It does not require the milices. It requires only 4 things: concentrated authority, a framework for naming enemies, procedures that generate their own fuel, and the absence of external accountability. If you give it those 4 and the specific costume it wears, the witch, the heretic, the traitor, the enemy of the people, all of that is a detail. It's all interchangeable, and it's all cosmetic. This is what I meant an hour ago about the echo. Würzburg and Bamberg did not rhyme because something haunted Franconia. They rhymed because they ran the exact same machine. And the machine runs exactly the same every time. And any machine that can be assembled twice, 80 miles apart, can be assembled anywhere, in any century, under any flag, in service of any ideology willing to name an internal enemy and remove the brakes. The echo we heard between two German cities in 1626 is not a sound that's trapped in the past. It's a sound a particular machine makes every time somebody builds it. And it has been built and rebuilt a great many times since 1626. You can build it with an ideology. You can build it inside of a sufficiently powered institution. You can build it in any community frightened enough to want one. Because we have, and we do, and we keep on doing it. The witch trial is not a historical aberration. It is a template, and the template shifts, but that mechanism holds. The Würzburg Chronicle still sits active in the archive today. A bureaucratic document, column after column of names and descriptions. The work of clerks who turned up to their jobs every day and wrote it down, in a steady hand, what was being done to their neighbors. And in Bamberg, the Eunice letter sits behind the official confession that it was written to refute, the counter record, the truth, surviving against every intention of the men who filled the lie. The blind girl, the boy of 10, the girl of 15, the pretty young woman, the little daughter of the doctor, George Hahn and his wife and his daughter, Johann Eunice, writing to Veronica, with hands that could no longer fully close. These are not abstractions. They were people. They had families, and histories, and fears. And that particular irrevocable quality of being alive that no ledger can hold and no episode can bring back. And the men who ran the trials were not, in the main, monsters. They were educated, dutiful, institutionally embedded men who believed that they were defending their communities from a real and present danger. They were wrong. And they were wrong in a way that required them to burn children. But they were not, by the ordinary measure of how human evil is produced, unusual people. And that's the thing that these trials keep insisting on. Every time I come back to them, and I have stopped hoping that they will say something easier. The extraordinary scale of the harm did not require extraordinary people. It required ordinary people, following a procedure, inside of an institution, with no one powerful enough standing on the outside to say stop. And that was the whole of what was missing. Not better people, not better theology. One person with enough standing willing to bear the cost of saying stop. And saying it in time. Hahn tried from the inside, and he was burned to death with his family. Spee tried from a careful distance, anonymously, and he lived, and he was actually right, but it was too late for hundreds already that were in the ground. The Chronicle is a record of what ordinary people do when the system asks them to, and nobody says stop. And I think that we need to sit with that. This has been the Velvet Guillotine, and I'm April Rain. For further reading, Lyndall Roper's Witch Craze, Terror and Fantasy in Baroque Germany, is the most rigorous and humane treatment of the German trials available in English. Brian Levick's The Witch Hunt in Early Modern Europe, that gives the broader comparative frame. The surviving letter of Johann Eunice is available in translation and is worth reading in full. And Frederick Spee's Precautions for Prosecutors is worth reading not only as a historical document, but as a case study in what it costs to say stop. The postscript this week steps back from Würzburg and Bamberg to read the social data across the entire witch trial era. Who was accused, what they had in common, and what the accuser stood to gain. Because the data, looked at clearly, says things that the theological framework very much preferred that you did not notice. So until next time, stay dark.